In the Pacific War, nothing was more terrifying than a small island transformed into a fortress of concrete and steel. It was there that American Marines had to face an invisible enemy, hidden deep underground, resilient to an absurd degree. They needed a weapon that could turn those impregnable bunkers into infernos. They had one. It was the American M2 flamethrower. But there is a story, a secret buried under the ashes of war, about a Marine who found another solution, a forbidden solution, an enemy solution. This isn't just a story about tactics or weapons. This is a story of desperation, ingenuity, and a small act of rebellion that changed the course of a battle. An act that turned a captured Japanese Type 100 flamethrower, which should have been destroyed, into the ultimate bunker destroyer of the Pacific. Welcome to Secrets of World War II. Today, we're opening the file on one of the most controversial weapons and discovering why, in the thirst for survival, one American soldier had to steal the enemy's tools to get his job done. To understand this story, we must return to the darkest days of the island-hopping campaign. Islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and especially Iwo Jima were not idyllic sandy beaches. They were deadly labyrinths. The Japanese military had learned bitter lessons from its early defeats. Instead of trying to fight on the beaches, they withdrew into a deep, complex defense system. Built over years, thousands of shelters, bunkers, and caves were connected by a tangled network of tunnels. They were reinforced with thick concrete, timber, and earth, making artillery and bombs almost useless. For the Marines, every step forward was a bloody struggle. Rifles, grenades, even high explosives could only scratch the surface. The enemy hid, waited, and fired back from tiny apertures. The casualty rate soared. A solution was needed. And that solution, according to American military doctrine, was the flamethrower. The American M2 flamethrower was a formidable weapon. Weighing about 70 pounds, around 32 kg when full, it could spew a thick, burning stream of fire for about 7 to 10 seconds, with a maximum range of about 40 meters. It was a terrifying psychological tool, forcing the enemy to expose themselves or be incinerated in their shelters. But the M2 had critical flaws. It was heavy, making the soldier operating it an easy target. And, more importantly, it used a special fuel, usually napalm, compressed with nitrogen gas. The system was complex, prone to malfunctions, and sometimes the flame stream wasn't thick enough to penetrate deep into the most fortified shelters. Imagine you're a Marine, pinned down by gunfire, just yards from a bunker. You're carrying 70 pounds of metal and fuel on your back. You know that when you stand up and activate that M2, you will be the #1 target. And if your stream of fire isn't strong enough to silence that bunker, you and your buddies will die. In that context, some soldiers began to look for alternatives, and they found it in the wreckage of the enemy. The Japanese flamethrowers, primarily the Type 93 and its improved version. The Type 100 were a completely different story. They were designed based on European models but had one crucial difference. While the American M2 used a complex compressed gas ignition system, the Type 100 had a simple but extremely effective ignition mechanism, a 6-round cylinder, like a miniature revolver mounted at the end of the nozzle. Each time the trigger was pulled, a blank cartridge would fire, creating a powerful spark to ignite the fuel. But the key point wasn't the ignition mechanism. It was the fuel and the pressure. The Type 100 used a cruder fuel mixture, often gasoline mixed with oil or tar. This created a thicker, longer burning, and more adhesive stream of fire. Furthermore, the Type 100's pressure system, although it had a slightly shorter range than the M2, about 22 to 27 meters compared to 40 meters, maintained a more stable fuel flow for the entire 10 to 12 seconds of continuous spray. For a bunker, this made the difference between a flame that licked the surface and a flame that penetrated deep inside, burning up all the oxygen and turning the enclosed space into an inescapable hell. But why was it forbidden? There was no formal U.S. military order against using captured enemy flamethrowers. However, there was an unwritten rule, and sometimes a formal regulation, against using enemy weapons in combat. The reason was practical and brutal. The risk of friendly fire, in the chaos of close-quarters combat, especially in jungles or trenches. A G.I. carrying a distinctively shaped flamethrower, known to be a Japanese weapon, would make him a target for his own comrades. A Marine, seeing a silhouette carrying a Type 100, would have only one thought: that's the enemy. Furthermore, the U.S. military wanted to standardize weapons and ammunition. Using captured weapons created problems with logistics, maintenance, and fuel supply. The order was capture, report, and destroy. But for some soldiers, those rules were just meaningless whispers in the face of death. We'll call this Marine Sergeant Torch. His real name has been lost in declassified records, or perhaps it was deliberately omitted to protect him from later trouble. Torch was a flamethrower specialist in a combat engineering unit on a small, brutal island in late 1944. Torch's unit was stuck. A main bunker, dubbed the Dragon's Lair, had held up an entire company's advance for 3 days. Every attempt, from TNT charges to M2 flamethrowers, had failed. The M2 could only spray fire into the aperture for a few seconds before the pressure dropped, and the flame couldn't penetrate the bunker's complex ventilation system. During a reconnaissance after an artillery barrage, Torch and a teammate found a small Japanese weapons cache. In it, there was an intact Type 100 with a full fuel load and a spare box of ignition cartridges. Torch stared at the enemy weapon. He had been using the M2 for months and knew its limitations well. He recalled intelligence reports on the Type 100's performance, a steadier, stickier stream, and, most importantly, a more reliable ignition mechanism. He made a decision that went against every rule. He stole that flamethrower. He and his teammate disassembled his M2, hid it under a pile of debris, and replaced it with the Type 100. They had to camouflage it. They used mud and canvas to cover its most obvious identifying features, trying to make it look like a badly damaged M2. This act wasn't just a military risk, it was a legal one. If caught, Torch could be court-martialed for disobeying orders and using unauthorized weaponry. But for him, the survival of his buddies was more important than any rule. The next morning, the assault on the Dragon's Lair was renewed. Torch, with the Type 100 on his back, led the way. As he crawled into position, the bunker opened up again. Torch knew he had one chance. He stood up, aimed the nozzle at the main aperture, and pulled the trigger. The Type 100 stream was nothing like the M2's. It wasn't a powerful, brief burst. It was a thick, viscous, sustained river of liquid fire, maintained by steady pressure. It didn't just hit the surface. It penetrated deep inside. Torch held the trigger. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The stream was still strong, with no sign of weakening. He used nearly half a tank of fuel, spraying continuously for about 5 to 6 seconds. Immediately, thick black smoke began to pour out of the bunker's other vents and apertures. The Type 100's adhesive fuel had done what the M2 could not. It had pushed deep into the ventilation system, burning up all the oxygen and superheating the interior to an unlivable temperature. A few seconds later, the gunfire from within the bunker stopped. A total silence. When the assault team approached, they found no survivors. The dragon's lair, the impregnable fortress, had been neutralized by the enemy's own technology, wielded by the audacity of one American Marine. This story spread through the unit, not as an official report, but as a battlefield legend. Marines began to look for captured Type 100s. They realized that, for this type of combat, the enemy's weapon, with its different technical characteristics, was more effective than their standard issue. The truth is, in the Pacific War, the line between rules and survival was often blurred. The use of captured weapons was not rare. Arisaka rifles, Nambu machine guns, and even samurai swords were taken home by GI as trophies. But a flamethrower was different. The ban on using captured weapons wasn't just about safety and logistics. It was also about psychology. The U.S. military wanted to maintain a clear distinction between us and them. A GI using an enemy weapon could cause confusion and undermine unit cohesion. However, the story of Torch and other soldiers like him proved one thing. The ingenuity and adaptability of the American soldier are limitless. When faced with a problem that couldn't be solved with standard tools, they would find a way. This story also highlights the difference in weapons design philosophy between the two sides. The American M2 was designed for longer range, fitting an open assault doctrine. The Japanese Type 100, with its shorter range but steadier, stickier stream, was perfectly suited for destroying fortifications, reflecting their doctrine of dug-in defense. After the war, the story of the captured Type 100 became an anecdote. It was never put into the official history textbooks, but it was retold in bars and at veterans' reunions. It was a reminder that, in war, effectiveness is everything. Torch's story isn't just about a flamethrower, it's about the Marine Corps spirit: never give up, always find a way, no matter the rules. Flamethrowers, whether the M2 or the Type 100, were brutal tools, but they were necessary tools to end a brutal war. The story of the stolen Type 100 is a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the men who fought in the hell of the Pacific. What do you think of Sergeant Torch's actions as breaking the rules to save your comrades, an act of heroism? Share your thoughts in the comments below. To truly understand the weight of the decision Sergeant Torch made, we need to dive deeper into the psychological and technical context of the Island War. Let's look at the technical details. The American M2 flamethrower, despite being the standard issue weapon, had an inherent problem with its pressure system. It used compressed nitrogen to propel the fuel. As the fuel tank emptied, the gas pressure also decreased, leading to a weaker and less stable stream at the end of the spray cycle. This meant that, after the first few seconds, the M2 operator faced the risk of the stream not being strong enough to neutralize the target, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Conversely, the Japanese Type 100, with its simpler design, had a surprising advantage. Although its maximum range was shorter, it was designed to maintain a constant fuel flow for the entire duration of the spray. This was due to the design of the tanks and nozzle, which were optimized for attacking fortifications at close range. The Type 100's stream was described as a river of fire, rather than the jet of fire from the M2. Furthermore, the M2's ignition was also a weak point. The M2 used an electrical or chemical ignition system, which was susceptible to the humidity and harsh conditions of the Pacific. The Type 100, with its reliable blank cartridge mechanism, ensured that every pull of the trigger resulted in fire. In combat, the difference between an ignition system that works 90% of the time and one that works 99% of the time is the difference between life and death. For Sergeant Torch, who had seen his M2 fail multiple times against fortified bunkers. The Type 100 wasn't just a captured weapon, it was a technically superior tool for the specific mission he was facing. We've talked about the unofficial ban on captured weapons, but the trophy hunting culture was an integral part of the war. Abbas regularly collected guns, swords, flags, and personal items from Japanese soldiers. However, a flamethrower was a completely different category of weapon. It wasn't a personal item, it was a heavy weapon system. A soldier carrying a non-standard heavy weapon system was a serious problem for commanding officers. Imagine a logistics officer having to explain why a Japanese flamethrower appeared in the arsenal of a Marine unit. It set a dangerous precedent. If Torch was allowed to use the Type 100, then other soldiers would start using Nambu machine guns, Japanese pineapple grenades, or any other weapon they found. This would lead to chaos in ammunition, maintenance, and, most importantly, the risk of friendly fire would increase exponentially. For these reasons, commanding officers often issued strict prohibitions on the use of captured weapons. This ban wasn't a rule of the Geneva Convention. It was a practical combat rule to maintain order and safety. But Torch broke that rule. He put effectiveness above the rules. He put survival above logistics. After the Dragon's Lair was neutralized, the story of the Type 100 became a legend in Torch's regiment. It wasn't just a story of bravery, but a story of intelligence. The Marines started calling the Type 100 the Dragon Slayer. They realized that, in the Island War, where everything was built to resist conventional firepower, they needed something unconventional. American weapons experts later studied captured Type 100 models. They had to admit that, for the bunker-busting mission, the Japanese design had clear advantages. The steadier, stickier stream was the decisive factor. However, the U.S. military never officially adopted these features into the M2. The reason was that they were already shifting to other solutions, like flame tanks, especially the Sherman versions equipped with flamethrowers, which proved exceptionally effective on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But, at the time, Torch made his rebellious move. Flame tanks were still scarce. He had to find his own solution to his problem. Torch's story is a classic example of the MacGyver spirit of the American soldier. When faced with an impossible problem, they will use whatever is at hand, including the enemy's weapons, to get the job done. Torch's action didn't just save his buddies' lives, it served as a reminder that, in war, innovation often comes from the front line, not from labs or command offices. Imagine the psychological pressure Torch was under. He not only had to face enemy fire, but also the judgment of his own comrades. He had to keep his stolen flamethrower a secret, even as it was saving their lives. This is a story of quiet courage, a small act of rebellion carried out in the shadows that brought light to soldiers trapped in hell. The story of the captured Type 100 is a small but important, chapter in the history of the Pacific War. It is a testament that sometimes, to win, you have to be willing to break the rules you were taught to follow. And that is why, after more than 80 years, the story of Sergeant Torch and his forbidden flamethrower still resonates. It is a hymn to the ingenuity, courage, and indomitable spirit of the soldiers who fought and won the most brutal war in history. For an American audience, especially those aged 35 to 65 plus. This story touches a deep emotional chord. It's not just military history. It's a story about individualism and the American spirit. Our audience grew up with stories of World War II heroism, where American soldiers were portrayed as liberators, always fighting with the world's best tools. But Torch's story complicates that picture. It shows that, even with America's industrial might, there were moments when the enemy's technology was more effective, and it took a soldier with enough courage to admit that and act on it. This is a lesson in humility in war. It reminds us that victory doesn't just come from overwhelming force, but from the ability to learn and adapt, even if it means learning from the enemy. Think about the men and women who have served in the military, or have relatives who served. They understand that in combat, theory and rules often evaporate. The only thing that matters is completing the mission and bringing your comrades home safely. Torch's action, while a violation of regulations, was a moral act in the context of the battlefield. This story is also a tribute to the combat engineers. The Marines who carried the flamethrowers, the sappers, the demolition men, they were the tip of the spear, the ones who had to face the enemy at the closest range, often with the highest casualty rates. The casualty rate for flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima was a horrifying figure. Some units reported casualty rates as high as 92%. This means that when Torch strapped that Type 100 to his back, he wasn't just accepting the risk of being shot by his own side, he was accepting the near-certain risk of being wounded or killed. His choice was not one of convenience. It was a choice of desperation. He needed a tool that would guarantee that when he stood up and sprayed fire, the job would get done. He couldn't afford the risk of the M2 failing, and that's what makes this story so compelling to our audience. It's a story of personal sacrifice for the good of the group. It's a story of American pragmatism, where the result matters more than the form. Let's go back to the Type 100. Its design, with 3 cylindrical tanks, 2 for fuel, and 1 central compressed air tank, created a distinctly different silhouette from the American M2. The fact that Torch had to camouflage it with mud and canvas shows he fully understood the risk of friendly fire. But that camouflage is also a symbol. It represents him having to hide the truth in order to do the right thing. He had to become a quiet rebel to be an effective hero. This story also opens up a wider discussion about innovation in wartime. Was the U.S. military too rigid in its rules and standards? Should it have been more flexible in adopting enemy technologies when they proved effective? In the case of the Type 100, the answer is clear. The delay in recognizing and applying the superior technical aspects of the Japanese flamethrower cost many Marines their lives. But it's thanks to soldiers like Torch, who were willing to bet their careers and their lives on trying something new, that the American military eventually found ways to neutralize those concrete fortresses. The story isn't just a historical secret, it's an eternal lesson in leadership, innovation, and the pragmatic nature of war. It's a reminder that, in the most extreme situations, the soldiers on the front lines are often the smartest, most creative people in the room. That is why this story of the stolen flamethrower deserves to be told. It is part of the Marine Corps legacy, a testament to the spirit of Semper Fi, always faithful, not just to the nation, but to the men at your side. Remember, history isn't just written by generals and grand battles. It's also written by the small, daring acts of anonymous soldiers who did extraordinary things under terrible circumstances. Thank you for joining us to explore this secret. We'll see you on the next episode of Secrets of World War II.